There are 74 operators in Rainbow Six Siege, each having their own unique gadget that brings something useful to the table. Some operators have been nerfed too heavily, while others have only gotten more balanced. So in today's video, I'll be going over the evolution of every Siege operator. To start, let's rewind to December 1st of 2015. This was the release date of Rainbow Six Siege after its beta. This introduction would include all of the first operators added to Siege. For the attackers, you had Sledge, Thatcher, Ash, Thermite, Twitch, Monty, Glaz, Fuse, Blitz, and IQ. On the defense, all you had was Smoke, Mute, Castle, Pulse, Doc, Rook, Kapkan, Tachanka, Jaeger, and Bandit. The game on release came out with only 20 operators, and the game at this point was pretty unbalanced. Not only because of bugs and unfair game mechanics, but because some of these operators were way stronger than others. For example, take Bandit. Bandit, as of right now, is a perfectly balanced operator. An operator you situationally can use when he's needed, but not someone that's overpowered, and someone that takes skill to use. Back then, though, he was way more powerful. Take his MP7. His MP7 is one of the best SMGs in the game, and back then on the game's release, it had even less recoil and an ACOG scope. He also was the only wall denial operator in the game, and he was one of the only 3 speeds on defense as well. This made him a must-pick for most defensive lineups on any map you played him. He had a necessary ability with an easy to kill with weapon, and a lot of killing potential in general. Since then, he has gone on to be indirectly nerfed by Ubisoft taking away all ACOGs on 3-speed defenders, as well as the introduction of Cade and Tubarão into the game. More on them later though. For now, let's continue to talk about the operator's state back in the first year of Siege's release. There were more than just 1 or 2 operators that were overpowered on the game's release. Jaeger was even more overpowered than Bandit because his gadget was more powerful and unique, while also having a primary weapon with an ACOG. His primary weapon had less recoil, more damage, and more bullets back then too, so Jaeger was a force to be reckoned with. Like I said, there were many overpowered operators like Bandit, Jaeger, Ash, and Thatcher, but there were also operators that were underpowered like Glaz, Tachanka, Blitz, and Pulse. So for the start of the evolution of Siege operators, the operators were extremely unbalanced, but it would only get worse, it seemed, from here. Introducing Operation Black Ice. Operation Black Ice came with the 2 new operators, Buck and Frost. Buck offered a great alternative to Sledge, while Frost was seen as a good operator on her release. Not much up to this point changed for the majority of operators, other than a visual update to Glaz's scope and an update to Frost and Buck shotguns. However, there was one important change in the update 1.3.0 that I would like to mention, and that was the increased recoil Ubisoft added to the SMG-11. The SMG-11 is an SMG that at the time came on Smoke, Sledge, and Recruit. Back then, the SMG-11 had an ACOG and had almost no recoil. This made Sledge, who was already one of the better operators in the game, as well as Smoke, who was also good at the time, even better. Ubisoft, seeing this, decided to nerf the recoil of the SMG to decrease these operators' killing power. This update is particularly important to the evolution of Siege operators, as it would show that Ubisoft would use guns to balance operators instead of their gadgets. But let's move on to the next season, which is Operation Dust Line. This operation would introduce 2 very overpowered operators to the game at the time. The attacker, Blackbeard, on release was even more powerful than he is now. He only, in fact, had 1 shield, but it had so much health that you could use every bullet in 2 defenders' loadouts and still that shield would be alive. Valkyrie was just as good because she had what she has today, but with less competition, and the ability to throw cameras outside that didn't lose signal, allowing you to hide Valkyrie cameras in places untouchable to the attackers. This update is important in the evolution of Siege operators because it showed Ubisoft developers that they had to be a lot more careful about the balance of the operators before they released them. This would ultimately cause Ubisoft to release more balanced operators in the future up until the release of Lion, who I'll go over very shortly. For now though, let's move on to the next big step in the evolution of Siege operators, which is an Operation Red Crow. At this point, Caveira and Capitão had already come out, but this new season added the 2 operators Hibana and Echo. The reason these operators are important for this video's topic is because they are operators that do the same thing that other operators at the time already did. For example, before Hibana came out, Thermite was the only person on the attack that could breach open reinforced walls. This made him a must-pick every round, even though he wasn't necessarily all that overpowered. Compare the Thermite then to the Thermite now, who is arguably the weakest and most situational breacher of the 3, even though nothing much about him has ever really changed. This is important because it proves that another way that Ubisoft can evolve or balance operators is through adding new ones to the game that solve other operators' problems. Echo at the time did the exact same thing, Before Echo's release, Valkyrie was played all of the time, but because Echo was a camera operator that also had a great ability, this solved the Valkyrie issue, at least partially. We also see later down the line that Ubisoft took this to heart, because they did the same thing to balance Jaeger by introducing Wamai, they did this to Jackal by adding Dokkaebi, they added Maverick for Thatcher, Cade for Bandit, Mozzie for Mute, Goyo for Smoke, Thunderbird for Doc, and many, many more. You get the idea. They started to balance operators by introducing other operators that did the same thing, which is why I think that Operation Red Crow was a huge stepping stone in the evolution of operators in Rainbow Six Siege. But the next step in evolution for Siege was one that led, unfortunately, backwards, and that was update 2.3.0, otherwise known as Operation Blood Orchid. This season would introduce one of the first metas into Siege, which was the trap meta. To find out why this meta existed, you have to see the operators introduced in this season. The attacker Ying didn't really play into this meta, but was good overall. However, the defenders Lesion and Ella are where problems started to arise. Lesion was even better than he is now, with his traps being invisible and doing good damage. Ella was even more overpowered, with her gun having no recoil, high ammo count, and her being a 3-speed all made her the best fragger at the time to play. If you combine all of this with her trap ability, the Gersmont Mind, there were a total of 4 trap operators in the game that everyone was playing: Kapkan, Frost, Lesion, and Ella. With all of these operators being good at the time and people not being used to countering them quite yet, running all of these operators plus barbed wire and some wall denial made attacking almost impossible for most lineups. This made Ubisoft take the next big step in the evolution of Siege operators. Ubisoft was faced with a big question at this time. Should we nerf good operators, or should we buff weak ones? If, for instance, they buffed a new operator a ton to counter the strong ones, then that balancing also is an issue, as they might overtune some operators in the process. But to Ubisoft, that risk wasn't really worth it. It made the game more fun, sure, but for their growing esports scene, that made the game less fundable. So Ubisoft's answer to this problem was nerfing operators to balance them. Doing this had less risk than buffing overpowered operators' counters, but made the game less fun for the casual player. To finalize this philosophy, they nerfed Ella to the ground in update 2.3.2. This update would nerf her SMG considerably by giving her a lot of recoil, as well as nerfing the trap meta by taking away one of her mines in the process. As a side note to the trap meta, in this update they also made Kapkan traps not insta-kill, only doing 60 damage per trap, as well as letting Blitz sprint with the shield in front of his face. All of these changes and more were assigned to everyone watching and playing that Ubisoft would prioritize nerfing operators as a balancing metric, which will come very important later in the evolution of operators in Rainbow Six Siege. For now though, let's move on to a less eventful step in the evolution of operators, which is the next season, Operation White Noise. Operation White Noise introduced the two operators Vigil and Dokkaebi. Vigil's ability would make him invisible to cameras, while Dokkaebi's ability allowed you to hack cameras on the defense and roam clear with ease. At first, this new season wasn't all that influential, and neither were their operators. It wasn't until the next season that one of these operators' potential would be fully realized, which was Dokkaebi. Again, on release, Dokkaebi wasn't seen as that strong due to her loadout, but with Operation Chimera, things for her and every other operator would change, and they would change for the worse. Operation Chimera introduced two attackers to the lineup, the first being Finka, who was at launch a bad operator. She didn't bring much to the table, and she couldn't revive herself yet. On the other hand, we have Lion, who was the most broken attacker ever released, even to this day. Lion on release would be able to use his scanner and immediately get wall hacks on the entire enemy team if they move, similar to what we have now, but instead of giving you a ping like you got today, you got a red outline of the defender, allowing you to get a perfect headshot every single time. Like I said, literal wall hacks. This paired up with Dokkaebi's call made one of the most worst siege metas ever, which was the rush meta. At the time as well, Bolo was getting very popular, and people were also using Ashe and rushing with her R4C, and people were also using Ying for executes. It was one of the worst times to be playing the game, and Ubisoft had to do something. This would be one of the worst steps in the evolution of siege operators, which was the information meta. After Lion came out, the next operation was Operation Parabellum. This operation came with the two defenders Alibi and Maestro. Alibi at the time was very weak, just like she is today. However, Maestro, on the other hand, was a completely different story. Maestro only had 2 Evil Eyes, but he also had 2 punch-proof Evil Eyes and an ACOG on his already great LMG. When you pair this up with Lion, Dokkaebi, Valkyrie, and Echo before his nerf, Mira, Alka, and Jackal, you start to see that every meta and broken operator in the game gave something with information. Every attacker and defender was constantly bringing information, or at least information denial, and the game became less about breaching and getting the bomb down and more about insta-locking IQ and Echo. The crazy part about this was that Ubisoft just didn't see the problem here and made it actually worse. On patch 3.2.2, they would go to buff some of these operators, giving Dokkaebi flashes, increasing Jackal's scan range, and giving IQ frag grenades. Around this time, they would finally get to nerfing Lion, but it took them a total of 8 months to do so, after the amount of months it also took to get him barred from Pro League. This is another important stepping stone for Siege balancing, which was Ubisoft's inefficiency. Ubisoft took too long to make needed changes, and even changes they did make were pretty subpar. This would eventually lead to the next step in the evolution of Siege operators, an evolution where people cared way too much about operators' secondary utility, which was the utility meta. To see what I mean, let's fast forward to Operation Ember Rise. Operation Ember Rise gave way to Goyo and Amaru. Amaru wasn't any good at all, but Goyo was one of the most broken operators on defense at his launch. At the time, Goyo put his canisters on a deployable shield and had 3 deployable shields at his disposal. This paired up with a deployable shield rework made deployable shields from the worst to the best secondary gadget in the game. Pair this up with Jaeger and Wamai, who was released the next season, and it was completely impossible to clear all of the utility that the defense provided. This was the most defender-sided point of Rainbow Six Siege's history. Because of this, the evolution of Siege would be mainly towards the defenders at the time being. They would nerf the defense by nerfing Jaeger ADSs and his loadout, essentially causing attackers to not have to bring in 9 different flash grenades to clear just 1 shield. They also had to worry about the 3 other shields that Goyo brought, as well as the Wamai discs that covered those too. To do this, they eventually just reworked Goyo to not bring shields, but to bring canisters, as everyone was using him for his shields and not for his canisters. Siege operators as a whole evolved to become less reliant on their utility as to not cause another utility meta in the future. But Ubisoft would eventually take this too far, and to the other extreme by introducing the 1.5 times scope. Operation Shadow Legacy brought a lot of changes, Zero being the new operator for one, but the introduction of the 1.5 and 2x scopes were even worse. The 1.5 times scope was super influential as it had no downsides. It could take long and short range gunfights with ease, while also having a non-invasive crosshair. This scope was so good that any other operator with this scope would be a lot easier to play. This made it to where operators who were used for their utility suddenly weren't anymore. Operators evolved from being utility focused to kill focused. The operator Warden is a great example. Warden back then was only used for his utility, a shield and to stop smoke plants. That's pretty much it. On the weaker side, but still a balanced operator nonetheless. When the 1.5 times scope was added to his MPX, everything for Warden changed. He was suddenly played every round because his scope allowed him to get very easy and consistent kills. This didn't only happen to Warden, but to any defender or attacker they gave a 1.5 times scope to. Operators like Ayana, Alibi, Oryx, Thorn, Frost, and Finkav, just to name a few. Operators evolved for killing potential instead of utility potential. But even after everything I've said and the LMG meta that would come a few seasons later, Ubisoft would find a way to rein everything back in and ultimately evolve Siege operators to a more balanced state than ever. Enter Operation Deadly Omen. Operation Deadly Omen brought the operator Deimos, but that's not actually what's important here. What's important is that this operation would bring the scope rework that removed the 2x and the 1.5 times scopes and replace them with the more magnified versions of themselves that we know today. This would essentially fix the issue of operators being ran for their guns and people using them to just get kills. This paired up with all of the balancing they've done in the past to utility, evolved Siege operators to a more balanced state. You can still run in and get kills if you need to or want to, but playing each operator for their utility is more accepted and useful than ever, and not to a point where it's an issue like in the utility meta. So overall, how have Siege operators evolved? Well, if you compare them now to a few years ago or even to the game's launch, I'd say they've evolved for the better, and that they've evolved to become the most balanced they've ever been. But with that out of the way, my name's Alka, check out this next video, and I hope we'll see you there.